They say every Walmart is the same, but they've clearly never worked the night shift at Pine Hollow. That was the thought running through my head as I stood at the edge of the parking lot, gazing at the worn exterior of Walmart number 3295. The building looked almost abandoned under the dim yellow glow of a single overhead lamp, the cracked pavement of the lot stretching into shadows that seemed to reach forever. A thick line of pines bordered the property, their tall silhouettes swaying slightly in the breeze. It was hard to believe this quiet, rural store was now my home for the foreseeable future. My name's Eric Matthews, and I love working at Walmart. I know how that sounds, but it's true. I started as a seasonal worker back in high school, working the holiday rush with my friends. Over time, I climbed the ladder, becoming one of those people who genuinely enjoy stocking shelves, organizing inventory, and cracking jokes with coworkers. There's a rhythm to it all, something methodical and satisfying about turning chaos into order. When I got the chance to transfer to Pine Hollow, I jumped at it. The idea of small-town life, surrounded by the quiet beauty of North Dakota's forests, seemed like a dream. My old store was in the middle of a bustling city with constant noise, endless crowds, and little room for peace. I thought Pine Hollow would be a chance to slow down, meet some friendly faces, and settle into a more tranquil routine. As I walked into the store for my first shift, the automatic doors opened with a faint whoosh, and I was greeted by the familiar smell of cleaning products mixed with a faint trace of something metallic. Inside, it was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels almost too heavy. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the store stretched out in all directions, aisles fading into shadows. Despite the stillness, the place felt alive somehow, like it was watching me. I shook off the thought. New places always feel strange at first. I headed toward the break room, where I was scheduled to meet my new supervisor. The break room was small but functional, with a table, a vending machine, and lockers lining the far wall. A coffee maker sputtered faintly in the corner, sending up steam that smelled like burnt beans. Sitting at the table was Randy, the night supervisor, who looked exactly like the kind of guy who'd been working Walmart night shifts for 20 years. His gray Walmart vest was faded and patched, and his eyes carried a permanent air of exhaustion. "You're the transfer?" he asked without looking up from his thermos. "Yeah, Eric Matthews," I replied, extending a hand. He shook it briefly, his grip firm but disinterested. "Randy. Welcome to Pine Hollow. Hope you like weird hours and even weirder company." "Company?" I asked, laughing nervously. "Not many customers come in this late, right?" Randy smirked but didn't answer directly. "You'll figure it out." He gestured toward the time clock. "Punch in, and I'll show you the ropes." I followed him out onto the floor, my sneakers squeaking on the polished tiles. The aisles looked pristine, with everything neatly stocked, almost too perfect. Randy handed me a clipboard with my assignments for the night, restocking electronics, cleaning the back room, and organizing the seasonal aisle. Nothing out of the ordinary. As we walked toward the stockroom, Randy slowed his pace and glanced around, lowering his voice. "You're gonna find a list back there. The rules. They're not a joke." I blinked. "Rules? Like safety stuff?" "No," he said flatly, turning to face me. "The real rules. They're important. Read them, follow them, and you'll be fine. Most of the time." "Most of the time?" I asked, laughing again, though it sounded less confident this time. Randy didn't laugh with me. Instead, he muttered, "Just take it seriously. You'll understand soon enough." The stockroom was cold, colder than it should have been considering the summer air outside. Metal shelves stretched to the ceiling, filled with pallets of unopened boxes. A faint hum came from the fluorescent lights overhead, their glow casting long shadows that danced as we moved. Randy pointed to a locker in the corner. "There," he said. "Inside." I opened the locker and found a laminated sheet of paper taped to the door. The words were printed in large, blocky letters, and the paper looked old, yellowed at the edges, like it had been there for years. Rules for the night shift at Walmart number 3295. Rule number 1, open the gates at 12 a.m. to 1 a.m. Rule number 2, if a customer enters after 2 a.m., do not make eye contact. Rule number 3, never enter aisle 13 after midnight, even if it's on your list. Rule number 4. If you hear someone whisper your name over the PA system, respond with, "I'm here," and continue working. Rule number 5. Do not rearrange the mannequins in the seasonal department. Rule number 6. If you see a cart move on its own, leave it and go to another aisle. Rule number 7. Always restock the batteries first, no matter what your shift list says. Rule number 8. If you hear the toy aisle music after 3 a.m., clock out immediately and leave the building. At the bottom, someone had scrawled in pen, "Break these rules, and you'll regret it." I turned to Randy, raising an eyebrow. "Seriously?" His face was grim. "You'll see. Just follow the rules." My first few hours passed uneventfully. Stocking shelves was as routine as ever, and the quiet hum of the store felt almost comforting. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, that heavy stillness returned, wrapping around the aisles like a suffocating fog. I made my way to the loading bay, clipboard in hand, just as the clock struck 12. The gates loomed before me, tall and industrial, with the faint sound of wind rattling through the cracks. My chest tightened as I glanced at my watch. 12:01 a.m. I reached for the controls and hesitated. The rules didn't explain why I had to open the gates, or what might happen if I didn't. With a deep breath, I pressed the button. The gates groaned loudly as they slid open, revealing the dark, misty lot beyond. Nothing happened. I exhaled, laughing softly to myself. This is ridiculous. For the next hour, I checked my clipboard, shuffled boxes, and occasionally glanced outside. The mist seemed to thicken as the minutes passed, curling along the asphalt like ghostly fingers. At 12:59, I pressed the button again, closing the gates with a final metallic clang. It wasn't until I turned to leave that I noticed the footprints. Wet and faintly glowing, they led from the gates toward the aisles. But there was no sign of anyone else in the store. That's when I realized Randy wasn't kidding. Whatever this was, it was real. The shift dragged on after I closed the gates. I couldn't shake the image of those footprints, wet, glowing, and leading into the aisles. I'd followed them as far as the edge of housewares before they simply stopped, as if whoever, or whatever, had left them had disappeared into thin air. I told myself it was probably some kind of prank, maybe Randy trying to scare the new guy. But the way those prints shimmered, even in the dull fluorescent light, made my stomach churn. Back in the stockroom, I grabbed a box cutter and a fresh stack of batteries to restock. Rule number 7, always restock the batteries first. Another one of the strange instructions that had stuck with me since I read the list. The rules didn't make sense, but after the footprints, I wasn't about to test them. I wheeled the cart of batteries to electronics and started lining the shelves, glancing at my watch every few minutes. It was nearing 1:30 a.m. when I heard the faint rattle of a shopping cart somewhere behind me. It wasn't unusual to hear the occasional customer wandering the aisles during a night shift, but something about this sound made me uneasy. It was steady, mechanical, like someone was pushing the cart with deliberate purpose. I looked over my shoulder, but the aisle was empty. The sound grew louder, echoing faintly down the aisles. It seemed to circle me, moving closer, then farther away, as if it was testing how much noise it could make without revealing itself. My chest tightened as I remembered rule number 6. If you see a cart move on its own, leave it and go to another aisle. I wheeled my restocking cart to the next aisle, trying to focus on the shelves in front of me. But the rattling persisted, closer now. My pulse quickened, and my hands trembled as I reached for a pack of batteries. A sudden metallic clang behind me made me jump. I whipped around and saw it, a shopping cart standing perfectly still in the middle of the aisle. It wasn't mine. The cart was empty, except for a single, crumpled receipt at the bottom. I stared at it, frozen, as the air around me grew colder. The lights flickered briefly, casting strange, shifting shadows across the shelves. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I left the cart where it stood and bolted to the next aisle, gripping my clipboard so hard my knuckles ached. The rattling stopped. The silence that followed was worse. For the rest of the shift, I stayed close to the stockroom. Every noise made me jump, the hum of the lights, the occasional click of the PA system, even the faint creaks of the building settling. I forced myself to focus on small tasks, scanning inventory, breaking down boxes, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the feeling of being watched lingered, like an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. At 2:22 a.m., the PA system crackled to life. A low buzz filled the air, followed by a faint voice that sent a chill down my spine. Eric. It was my name. My own name, whispered in a voice that sounded eerily familiar, like a distorted version of myself. My breath hitched as I remembered rule number 4. If you hear someone whisper your name over the PA system, respond with, "I'm here," and continue working. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I'm here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The buzz on the PA system stopped immediately. Silence fell over the store once more, but the oppressive feeling didn't lift. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I'd just been marked somehow. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white, and forced myself to take slow, steady breaths. Randy's warning echoed in my mind, the rules aren't a joke. The rest of the night passed in a blur of nervous pacing and half-finished tasks. I avoided the electronics section entirely and stayed far away from the cart that had appeared in the aisle. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The morning sun felt surreal as I stepped into the parking lot, its warmth chasing away the lingering chill from inside the store. Randy was waiting by his car, his arms crossed. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone almost amused. I shot him a glare. "What the hell is going on in there, Randy?" "The gates, the PA system, the cart, this isn't normal." He didn't respond right away, just lit a cigarette and took a long drag. "Told you to follow the rules, didn't I?" I clenched my fists. "That's not an answer." He sighed, the smoke curling around his face like a veil. "Look, Eric, you're better off not asking questions. You wanted this transfer, remember? You're here now, and the only thing that matters is keeping your head down and doing your job. Follow the rules, and you'll be fine." "Most of the time," I muttered, recalling his words from earlier. "What happens the rest of the time?" Randy's expression darkened. "You don't want to know." He got in his car and drove off, leaving me standing in the lot, more confused and unsettled than ever. As much as I hated to admit it, he was right about one thing: I didn't want to know. Not yet, anyway. I needed to focus on surviving my shifts first. When I got home, I collapsed onto my bed, too tired to even change out of my uniform. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless. My dreams were filled with the sound of rattling carts and whispers that seemed to follow me no matter where I went. I woke up drenched in sweat, the rules running through my mind like a mantra. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a test, a game with rules I didn't understand and stakes I couldn't begin to fathom. But one thing was clear: breaking the rules wasn't an option. I had to play along. For now. I spent most of the next day trying to shake the unease from my first night. I told myself it was just nerves, the kind that come with working a new job in a strange place. Still, I couldn't forget the way my name had echoed through the PA system, the cart that seemed to move on its own, and the rules that were starting to feel less like a prank and more like survival instructions. That evening, as I prepared for my second shift, I decided to do some digging. If I was going to work under these bizarre conditions, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. My first stop was the employee break room, where a cluttered corkboard hung on the wall. Among the faded flyers and outdated schedules, there was an old photo of the Pine Hollow Walmart, taken not long after it opened in the 1980s. The store looked newer, cleaner, and somehow less ominous. A group of employees stood in front of the entrance, smiling for the camera. I recognized one of the faces immediately: Randy. He looked younger, his hair thicker, but it was unmistakably him. A chill ran down my spine. How long had he been working here? He didn't look much older now than he did in that photo. The thought gnawed at me, but there wasn't time to dwell on it. My shift was starting, and I couldn't afford to be late. The store felt different when I walked in that night, like it was watching me. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder than usual, and the aisles seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. Randy was nowhere to be seen, and I was alone in the stockroom when I found my task list for the night. It looked routine enough: restock toiletries, rotate cereal boxes, organize the seasonal department. But there was one line item that stopped me cold. Inventory check, aisle 13. Aisle 13. The forbidden aisle. The rule was clear: never go there after midnight. I stared at the list, my pulse quickening. Was this a mistake? A cruel joke? Or was someone, or something, testing me? Either way, I wasn't about to break the rule. I scratched the task off the list, grabbed my cart, and headed for the toiletries section, determined to stay as far from aisle 13 as possible. The first few hours passed uneventfully, though the air in the store felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. At 12 a.m. sharp, I made my way to the loading bay and opened the gates, just as the first rule instructed. The night outside was unnervingly still, the trees at the edge of the lot shrouded in mist. I waited, half expecting something to emerge from the darkness, but the hour passed without incident. I closed the gates at 1 a.m., relieved that at least one part of the job seemed straightforward. I was stocking cereal boxes when the PA system crackled to life again. My name echoed through the store, distorted and drawn out, like a recording played at half speed. Eric. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I'm here, I called out, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. The static stopped immediately, leaving behind an oppressive silence. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. As long as I followed the rules, I would be fine. Curiosity got the better of me during my break, and I decided to do some research. Using my phone, I searched for anything I could find about the Pine Hollow Walmart. Most of what I found was mundane: articles about grand openings, sales events, and minor incidents of theft. But buried among the search results was a local news article from 1997 detailing the disappearance of a night shift employee named Steve Carter. According to the article, Steve had been working alone one night when he vanished without a trace. His car was still in the parking lot, and his locker had been untouched. The only clue was a series of strange entries in the store's security logs, showing lights flickering in aisle 13 and the toy aisle at random intervals throughout the night. I scrolled through the comments section, hoping for more information. Most of the comments were from locals sharing vague rumors about the store being cursed or haunted. One comment, however, stood out: the rules are the only thing keeping us safe. Don't break them, no matter what. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in way over my head. Whatever was happening at this store wasn't just some harmless prank. It was real, and it was dangerous. I resolved to stick to the rules, no matter how strange they seemed. The rest of the night was uneventful until I reached the seasonal department. The mannequins, which had been dressed in winter coats and scarves earlier in the evening, were now wearing outfits that didn't match the display. One had a tattered dress, another a suit that looked decades out of date. I stared at them, my unease growing. Rule number 5 echoed in my mind: do not rearrange the mannequins. I didn't touch them, but as I turned to leave, I thought I saw one of the mannequins move out of the corner of my eye. I whipped around, but they were all standing perfectly still. My hands were shaking as I pushed my cart to the next aisle. At 2:30 a.m., I caught movement near the edge of the store. A man was walking down one of the aisles, his head tilted downward so I couldn't see his face. I tensed, remembering rule number 2: if a customer enters after 2 a.m., do not make eye contact. I turned my back to him, pretending to organize the shelves. He walked past me, his footsteps slow and deliberate, and I felt his presence linger just behind me. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I forced myself to keep working, acting as though I hadn't noticed him. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded, and when I finally turned around, he was gone. The rest of the shift was a blur of tension and paranoia. Every noise, every flicker of the lights, felt like a threat. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. As I clocked out and stepped into the morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that the store wasn't just a place I worked, it was something alive, something watching. My third night at Walmart started with a gnawing sense of unease. The events from the previous shifts lingered in my mind, replaying every whisper, every flicker of shadow. I had kept to the rules, and I had survived, but the rules themselves felt like the sharp edge of a knife, always present, always waiting for me to slip. Despite my fear, I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let a list of strange rules or unsettling phenomena drive me away. I'd worked hard to transfer here, and I wouldn't let anything ruin my fresh start. When I entered the store, the usual hum of fluorescent lights felt heavier, almost oppressive. The air was colder, too, even though it was a mild night outside. My task list was taped to the break room fridge as usual. Most of it was mundane: replenish canned goods, tidy up the electronics section, and clear out expired items from the freezer aisle. But one item stood out: check the mannequins in the seasonal department. A knot formed in my stomach. The mannequins had already unnerved me during my last shift. Their inexplicable wardrobe changes and the fleeting sensation that they moved when I wasn't looking had left me on edge. Still, the task was part of my job, and as long as I didn't rearrange them, I wouldn't be breaking any rules. I started with the freezer aisle, my breath visible in the unnaturally cold air. As I bent down to pull out expired cartons of ice cream, I heard a faint scraping sound from somewhere behind me. My first instinct was to turn, but I stopped myself. The rules hadn't mentioned this sound specifically, but I'd learned quickly that responding to anything out of the ordinary could lead to trouble. Instead, I stayed crouched, pretending to be engrossed in my work. The scraping continued, louder now, as if something heavy was being dragged across the tile floor. My heart pounded in my chest, and I clenched the edge of the freezer door, forcing myself to focus on my breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. I glanced over my shoulder, but the aisle was empty. The seasonal department was next, and I approached it with a mix of dread and determination. The mannequins were arranged in their usual positions, standing stiffly in a semicircle near the center of the department. Their winter outfits had been swapped out for spring clothing: floral dresses, khaki shorts, and wide-brimmed hats. A part of me wanted to laugh at how out of place they looked, but the sight of them only deepened my unease. As I counted the mannequins, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were 8 of them, just as there had been the previous night. But one of the mannequins, a tall figure in a bright sundress, was standing closer to the others than I remembered. I hadn't touched it, and no one else was here to move it. I stared at it for a moment too long, and in that silence, I heard something faint, a sound like fabric shifting, almost imperceptible. "Don't touch them," I whispered to myself, repeating the rule like a mantra. I quickly jotted down the count on my clipboard and left the department without looking back. Around 1:45 a.m., I made my way to the electronics section. The shelves were mostly in order, save for a few scattered video game cases and a rogue stack of DVDs that needed sorting. As I worked, I became aware of a strange sensation, a tingling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on arranging the DVDs alphabetically. That's when the PA system crackled to life again. Static filled the air, followed by a faint whisper. It wasn't my name this time. Instead, it was a single word, repeated over and over: leave. I froze, the DVD in my hand slipping to the floor. The whisper grew louder, almost urgent, as if whoever, or whatever, was speaking was pleading with me. My instinct was to run, but I remembered the rule: respond and continue working. "I'm here," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The static cut out immediately, and the store fell silent once more. But the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. By the time 2 a.m. rolled around, I was exhausted. My nerves were frayed, and every shadow seemed to twist into something sinister. I was in the middle of organizing canned vegetables when I heard the familiar chime of the automatic doors. My stomach sank. The rules were clear: if a customer entered after 2 a.m., I couldn't make eye contact. I glanced up briefly, just enough to see a figure entering the store. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a tattered coat that hung loosely around his frame. His head was tilted down, obscuring his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. I quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in stacking cans. The man wandered the aisles aimlessly, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent store. I could hear him muttering under his breath, though I couldn't make out the words. He passed by my aisle once, Then again, each time lingering just long enough to make my skin crawl. When he finally left, the chime of the automatic doors sounded like a gunshot, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I finished my tasks as quickly as I could after that, eager to be done with the shift. As I wheeled my cart back to the stockroom, I caught a glimpse of aisle 13 out of the corner of my eye. The lights above it flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. I stopped in my tracks, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. The rule was clear: never enter aisle 13 after midnight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing me toward it. I forced myself to keep walking, repeating the rules in my head like a prayer. When I reached the stockroom, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the breakroom couch, my hands trembling. As the end of my shift approached, I reflected on everything that had happened that night. The rules were no longer just a strange quirk of this Walmart, they were a lifeline. Something was wrong with this place, something beyond my understanding, and the rules were the only thing keeping me safe. I resolved to follow them no matter what, even if it meant working in fear every night. When the sun finally rose, I clocked out and left the store, the morning light doing little to ease my unease. As I drove home, I couldn't help but wonder what had drawn me to Pine Hollow in the first place. Was it really just a job transfer? Or had I been pulled here for a reason I couldn't yet comprehend? The fifth night started off with a sense of grim determination. After my experiences so far, the rules no longer felt like arbitrary guidelines, they were a shield against the unknown. The events of the previous shift lingered in my mind, sharpening my focus. I wasn't just a stalker anymore, I was a survivor, navigating the labyrinth of Pine Hollow's Walmart with a set of instructions I didn't fully understand but had learned to respect. When I arrived, the store was bathed in its usual fluorescent glow, but there was an oppressive stillness in the air, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The task list was waiting for me, taped to the fridge in the break room. Tonight's assignments were straightforward: stock the snack aisle, tidy the toy department, and rotate the produce. But at the bottom of the list was a new, handwritten note: check aisle 13. My stomach dropped. I stared at the words for several long seconds, my pulse quickening. Aisle 13 was off-limits after midnight. That was the rule. But this note hadn't been there before, and it wasn't part of the usual printout. Who had left it? And why? I debated whether to tell someone, perhaps management, but I quickly dismissed the thought. The store's mysteries were becoming my own burden to bear. No one else seemed to acknowledge them, and I doubted anyone would believe me if I tried to explain. Taking a deep breath, I folded the note and stuffed it into my pocket. I would follow the rules, as I always did, and I would avoid aisle 13 no matter what. I started my shift in the snack aisle, restocking bags of chips and boxes of crackers. The routine was a welcome distraction, each repetitive motion grounding me in the present. But the quiet soon became unbearable. The hum of the store's lights seemed louder than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I reached for a box of pretzels, a sharp clattering sound echoed from the far end of the aisle. I whipped around, my heart racing, but nothing was there. A lone bag of chips had fallen to the floor. It wasn't unusual for items to fall from shelves, but this felt intentional. The bag was positioned neatly in the middle of the aisle, as though someone had placed it there. I picked it up and returned it to its place, glancing over my shoulder the entire time. The toy department was next. As I approached, I could hear faint music drifting from the direction of the aisle. My blood ran cold. The tune was soft and distorted, like a lullaby played on a warped record. My first instinct was to turn back, but the rules were clear: clock out immediately if you hear toy aisle music after 3 a.m. It wasn't 3 a.m. yet, so technically, I was safe. Still, my steps were hesitant as I entered the aisle. The shelves were lined with stuffed animals, action figures, and plastic trucks, all bathed in the harsh glow of the overhead lights. The music grew louder, emanating from a toy display in the center of the aisle. I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning for movement. It was a simple display, a rotating rack of plush animals. A small speaker embedded in the base was playing the tune, but the mechanism seemed broken. The animals jerked unnaturally as they spun, their button eyes glinting in the light. I reached out to shut it off, but before I could touch the display, the music stopped abruptly, leaving the aisle in silence. I took a step back, my skin crawling. That's when I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a doll sitting on the edge of a shelf. It was an old-fashioned porcelain doll, its face pale and cracked, with a painted smile that felt more menacing than cheerful. I hadn't seen it when I first entered the aisle, and I certainly hadn't put it there. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself. I turned and left the toy department, forcing myself not to look back. Rotating the produce should have been the easiest task of the night, but even that felt like a test. As I rearranged apples and oranges, I heard the unmistakable sound of a cart rolling across the floor. It was coming from behind me. My heart thudded in my chest as I slowly turned, half expecting to see another employee or even a stray customer. Instead, the aisle was empty, except for a single cart. It was positioned perfectly in the center, as though someone had just left it there. Rule number 6 echoed in my mind: if you see a cart move on its own, leave it and go to another aisle. I obeyed without hesitation, walking briskly to the other side of the store. But as I passed the cart, I noticed something inside it, the porcelain doll from the toy aisle. Its painted eyes seemed to follow me as I walked by. The note about aisle 13 weighed heavily on my mind. I hadn't seen or heard anything that directly violated the rules, but the store's strange occurrences were growing more personal, as though whatever force haunted this place was singling me out. I returned to the stockroom, hoping to find some sense of normalcy in its cluttered shelves and faint smell of cardboard. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the direction of aisle 13. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like someone drumming their fingers against a wooden surface. I froze, the rules flashing through my mind like a warning siren. I didn't need to investigate. I didn't want to investigate. But the tapping continued, relentless, as though daring me to break the rules. I clenched my fists and stayed where I was, refusing to be lured into the forbidden aisle. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I let out a shaky breath, my resolve firm. I wouldn't give in. Not tonight. Not ever. The rest of the shift passed in a haze of tension. Every sound, every shadow, felt like a threat. I finished my tasks with mechanical efficiency, avoiding aisle 13 and keeping my head down. When 4 a.m. rolled around, I clocked out and left the store, my legs shaky but my will intact. As I stepped into the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that the store was watching me, its fluorescent lights glowing like eyes in the darkness. I climbed into my car and drove home, the headlights cutting through the empty streets of Pine Hollow. When I finally reached my apartment, I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but relieved. For now, I was safe. But as I stared at the ceiling, my mind replayed the night's events, and a single thought gnawed at the edges of my sanity: what would happen if I broke a rule? The next night arrived too quickly. I had spent the day restless, haunted by the doll in the cart and the steady tapping from aisle 13. Sleep was elusive, my dreams fractured by the faint melody of the toy aisle music. By the time I pulled into the Walmart parking lot for my shift, I was running on coffee and sheer determination. I had followed the rules faithfully, and as unnerving as the store was, I took pride in my discipline. Tonight would be no different. The air outside was colder than usual, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for Randy's old, beat-up truck still sitting in the corner. It hadn't moved since the night he quit. Seeing it there unsettled me, almost as if he were still watching, waiting for me to make the same decision. Shaking off the thought, I grabbed my things and headed inside. The store was eerily quiet when I arrived, the hum of the fluorescent lights louder than usual. A familiar chill ran down my spine as I clocked in and checked the night's task list. Stock cleaning supplies, reorganized the seasonal aisle, and rearranged the end caps in electronics. Straightforward enough. Yet my eyes drifted to the bottom of the page, half expecting another handwritten note like last night's. There was nothing. For a moment, I felt relieved, until I noticed the tiniest smudge of ink in the corner, like a fingerprint that didn't belong. It was a small thing, but it set me on edge. I started in the cleaning supplies aisle, loading bottles of bleach and disinfectant onto the shelves. The routine helped me focus, grounding me in something tangible. But that sense of stability didn't last long. Halfway through restocking a shelf of mops, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic squeak coming from further down the aisle. I froze, my hand still clutching a bottle of cleaner. It was the unmistakable sound of a cart's wheels. Rule number 6 echoed in my mind: if you see a cart move on its own, leave it and go to another aisle. I turned my head slowly, half expecting to see the porcelain doll sitting in the cart again. But the aisle was empty. The sound continued, though, growing louder, as if the cart were approaching. I backed away, careful not to make a sound, and turned the corner into the seasonal aisle. My heart pounded as I moved, and for a brief, absurd moment, I wondered if the cart could follow me. But the squeaking stopped abruptly, leaving the store in silence once more. I didn't dare look back. The seasonal aisle was in disarray. Halloween decorations had been hastily cleared out to make room for Christmas items, but the transition wasn't complete. Tinsel and garland hung limply from half-empty shelves, and a few scattered jack-o'-lanterns remained like forgotten relics of the previous season. Among the clutter stood the mannequins. They were arranged in a loose cluster near the back of the aisle, dressed in mismatched holiday attire. One wore a Santa hat, another a Halloween cape. Their faces were smooth and featureless, as though someone had erased them. I worked quickly, straightening the shelves and clearing debris, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the mannequins were watching me. When I finished, I turned to leave, and stopped dead in my tracks. One of the mannequins had moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a shiver through me. Its arm was raised, pointing toward aisle 13. I stepped back, my throat dry. "No," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to myself or the mannequin. I left the aisle without looking back. Electronics was my final task for the night. The end caps were cluttered with DVDs, video games, and discount headphones, all in need of rearranging. I threw myself into the work, eager to distract myself from the events of the night. But as I stacked the DVDs, I noticed something strange. The cases were all blank. No titles, no artwork, just smooth, black plastic. I picked one up, turning it over in my hands. It felt heavier than it should have, almost dense. I opened the case, expecting to find an empty slot where the disc should be. Instead, there was a single photo tucked inside. The image was blurry and dark, but I could make out the faint outline of a figure standing in the toy aisle. It wasn't a person, it couldn't be. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid. My stomach churned as I recognized the layout of the shelves in the background. This wasn't just a random photo. It was from tonight. I slammed the case shut and shoved it back onto the shelf. My hands trembled as I grabbed the remaining DVDs and rearranged them as quickly as I could. When I finished, I stepped back, taking a deep breath to steady myself. That's when the lights flickered. At first, it was just a faint flicker, a subtle dimming of the fluorescent bulbs overhead. But then the lights began to strobe, plunging the store into bursts of darkness. I froze, my heart racing, as the familiar static crackle of the PA system filled the air. "Eric," a voice whispered, low and distorted. It was my voice. Rule number 4, if you hear someone whisper your name over the PA system, respond with "I'm here" and continue working. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I'm here," I said, my voice shaking. The static stopped abruptly, and the lights returned to normal. But the silence that followed was suffocating, as though the store itself were waiting for me to make a mistake. The rest of the night was a blur of anxiety and vigilance. I completed my tasks with mechanical precision, avoiding aisle 13 and keeping my distance from the mannequins. When 4 a.m. finally arrived, I clocked out and left the store without looking back. As I stepped into the parking lot, the cold air hit me like a wave. I stood by my car for a moment, staring at the dark silhouette of the store against the faint glow of the horizon. Something about tonight felt different, darker, more personal. The store wasn't just testing me anymore. It was toying with me, pushing me to the edge. I climbed into my car and drove home, the distant hum of the Walmart sign fading into the night. But even as I pulled into my driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. My rearview mirror reflected nothing but darkness, yet the sense of being watched lingered long after I locked my door. The last night started like any other. I arrived at the store to find the parking lot bathed in the dim glow of flickering streetlights. Randy's old truck was gone, replaced by a single, unfamiliar sedan parked in the farthest corner. It was unusual, but I brushed it off as another late-night customer or maybe an employee who'd clocked out early. Inside, the air was heavier than usual, the fluorescent lights casting an unnatural glare on the polished floors. I clocked in, grabbed my task list, and made my way to the stockroom. The rules were where I'd left them, taped to the wall, their edges curling slightly. I read through them again, though I didn't need to. They were burned into my memory by now. Tonight, though, the rules felt alive, like a contract waiting to be fulfilled. I started my shift with the batteries. Rule number 7 had become something of a ritual. Restocking the batteries first gave me a sense of control, a way to anchor myself before the night unraveled. As I worked, I heard faint whispers from the PA system, but they were too distorted to make out. I ignored them and kept moving, my hands working quickly to stack and align the packs. When the aisle was finally done, I turned the corner and nearly dropped the last pack. The mannequins from the seasonal aisle were no longer in their usual place. They stood at the far end of the main aisle, perfectly aligned in a row. One of them was missing its head, its hollow neck tilted slightly, as though it were watching me. My throat tightened. I reminded myself of rule number 5, do not rearrange the mannequins in the seasonal department. I backed away slowly, refusing to turn my back on them. The store felt colder, the air heavy with an electric charge. I moved to the safety of the electronics section, my heart pounding. At midnight, the gates creaked open on their own. I didn't need to look at the clock to know the time, 12 a.m. on the dot. I approached the loading dock cautiously, every muscle in my body tense. The air inside the dock was icy, and the mist outside seemed thicker than ever. For the first time, there was something beyond the gates, a figure standing just at the edge of the fog. It was barely visible, shrouded in shadows, but I could tell it wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. My stomach churned as it took a single step forward, its form becoming clearer. Rule number 1 gave me a lifeline: open the gates from 12 a.m. to 1 a.m. I pulled the chain, opening the gates fully. The figure stopped, tilting its head in a motion that almost seemed curious. Then, without warning, it dissolved into the mist. I slammed the gates shut at exactly 1 a.m., my hands shaking as I locked them tight. As I walked back to the front of the store, I noticed something strange. The floor tiles in aisle 13 were cracked, tiny fractures spreading like a spider's web. I didn't stop to investigate. Rule number 3 had kept me alive this long, and I wasn't about to break it now. The PA system crackled again as I neared the seasonal aisle. This time, the whispers were clearer. It's time, Eric. Come and see. The voice was my own. The mannequins were gone. In their place was a single cart, filled with objects I couldn't quite make out. I turned away, forcing myself to focus on my tasks. At 3 a.m., the faint melody of the toy aisle music began to play. It was distorted, slowed, and warped, but I recognized the tune immediately. My chest tightened as I thought of rule number 8. If you hear the toy aisle music after 3 a.m., clock out immediately and leave the building. I moved quickly, keeping my head down as I approached the time clock. The music grew louder with every step, echoing through the store until it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. As I reached for my badge to clock out, a shadow passed across the screen. My reflection flickered, replaced by the faint outline of a face with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. I swiped my badge and bolted for the exit, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The music followed me all the way to my car. The parking lot was empty when I stepped outside. The sedan I'd noticed earlier was gone, and the streetlights had gone out, leaving the lot in near total darkness. I didn't stop to think about it. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I caught a glimpse of the store in my rearview mirror. The windows were dark, but something moved behind them, shadows flickering, too quick to be natural. The road stretched endlessly before me, the headlights barely piercing the dense fog that had settled over Pine Hollow. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel as I drove, my heart racing. The rules had kept me alive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the store wasn't finished with me. When I got home, the house was eerily quiet. The usual hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the floorboards were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. I turned on every light in the house, checking every room before finally collapsing onto the couch. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. I had made it through the final shift. I was done. The relief didn't last long. As I reached for the remote to turn on the TV, I noticed something on the coffee table, a laminated piece of paper, its edges frayed and yellowed. My stomach dropped as I recognized the block letters. Rules for Night Shift. My hands shook as I picked up the paper. It was identical to the list I had followed at Walmart, but at the bottom, a new rule had been added. Rule number 9, welcome back. The sound of a cart rolling across the floor broke the silence.